The message arrived at 03:14 a.m., routed through a dead server in Berlin that hadn't been officially active in 7 years. Agent Maven had learned long ago never to ignore messages that came through obsolete channels. Those were the ones that mattered most. The text was simple. 4 words. Scarlet Protocol activated. Return home. But Maven hadn't had a home in 16 years. Home was a concept reserved for people with normal lives, people who could walk down a street without checking for surveillance drones, people who didn't spend their evenings wondering if their reflection in a window was really their own or a projection created by someone tracking their movements. The safe house in Amsterdam was supposed to be secure. That's what the briefing document had promised, what handler Sinclair had assured him before the last operation. The Amsterdam location had never been compromised. It was a fortress. It was impenetrable. It was, Maven was now realizing as he stood in the abandoned apartment on the Kaisersgracht Canal, a trap waiting for him to walk through the door. He'd received the message 6 hours ago. In that time, he'd moved through 3 different neighborhoods, used 5 separate burn phones, and confirmed what he'd been afraid to confirm. Sinclair wasn't sending him home. Sinclair was sending him to a firing squad. If you were in his position, what would you do? Maven had worked with Sinclair for 12 years. 12 years of covert operations across 4 continents, 12 years of trusting his handler's judgment in life-or-death situations, 12 years of believing that despite the violence, despite the moral compromises, despite the constant violation of his own conscience, they were at least fighting for something real. But the Scarlet Protocol wasn't real. It was a fiction designed to consolidate power within the agency's upper ranks. It was a mechanism for eliminating operatives who'd seen too much, learned too much, understood too much about the structural corruption that held the intelligence community together like the mortar between bricks in a wall. The realization had hit him 3 weeks ago in a safe house in Cairo when he'd discovered the financial records that Sinclair had expressly ordered him to leave untouched. Those records documented 16 years of CIA funding being diverted to black budget operations that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with personal enrichment. Generals who'd retired to private security firms, directors who'd shifted money to offshore accounts, assistant directors who were literally selling classified intelligence to private military contractors. The machinery had become self-serving, and Maven had become a threat because he'd found the engine. The Dutch authorities wouldn't help him. The CIA had too much influence in Amsterdam. The local police were probably already flagged with his description, probably already being told that he was a rogue operative, a traitor, a security risk. The only way out was to disappear completely, to become so invisible that even the advanced surveillance networks the agency had access to would pass right through him without registering his presence. His hands trembled as he reviewed the bank account information he'd copied from Sinclair's secure server. $847 million, not spread across multiple accounts, all in one place, all traceable back to CIA funding allocations, all incriminating enough to bring down the agency's senior leadership. But the trembling wasn't from fear. The trembling was from rage. Pure, crystalline, absolutely consuming rage. He'd sacrificed everything for this organization. He'd given them 16 years of his life, 16 years of moral compromise, 16 years of watching people die in the name of strategic objectives that were sometimes real and often just convenient fictions designed to justify whatever violence the agency felt inclined to commit. And in return, the agency had become the very thing he'd supposedly been fighting against, a criminal enterprise wearing the uniform of legitimate government authority. The first hunter appeared at 11:47 a.m., standing on the bridge that spanned the canal, smoking a cigarette with the casual deliberation of someone who knew they were being observed and didn't care. Maven recognized him immediately. James Wolcott, one of the agency's best field operatives, trained in the same facility as Maven, operating under the same protocols, which meant Wolcott knew exactly how Maven thought, knew exactly what his contingencies would be, knew exactly which routes he'd take to escape the city. This wasn't a hunt, this was an execution.
The agency had decided that Maven was a liability, and they'd sent one of their best to make sure he never made it to a congressional hearing, never made it to a news organization, never made it anywhere that he could distribute the information he'd obtained. Maven moved through the apartment toward the window that faced the back alley. The second-floor access to the adjacent building was a jump of about 3 meters, difficult but survivable if the landing was clean. He stuffed the bank records into a waterproof container and secured them against his body. The agency's hunters could kill him. They probably would kill him, but they weren't getting those records. Those records were his insurance policy. Those records were his only leverage in a game where all the other players had nuclear weapons. He made the jump just as he heard the battering ram against the apartment's front door. The landing was rough, his left ankle screaming in protest, but the bone held. He was moving before the pain had fully registered, running through a neighbor's apartment, out through another window, down a fire escape that groaned under his weight. Behind him, he could hear Wolcott's voice shouting orders into a tactical radio. The other hunters were being mobilized. The net was closing. Every second that passed was a second closer to a bullet finding him, a second closer to the agency's version of justice being served. The Dutch Canal District was a maze of narrow streets and connecting alleyways. Maven had spent 2 weeks memorizing the geography of Amsterdam before he'd taken refuge in the safe house. That memorization had just saved his life. He ran through a market that was just opening for the day, the vendors completely unaware that one of the most hunted men in the Western intelligence community was moving past their stalls like a ghost. His face was already on every agency alert. His description was probably already being distributed to law enforcement across the Netherlands. The only thing keeping him alive was speed and the fact that ordinary people still couldn't process information fast enough to react to it in real time. By the time he reached the train station, Maven had lost his pursuers, but he knew the respite was temporary. The agency had satellite access, they had traffic cameras, they had the ability to predict his movements with algorithmic precision, and Wolcott's tactical expertise meant that Maven's contingency plans were probably already anticipated and already being countered.
He bought a ticket to Brussels using a false passport, one of 7 he'd maintained off the books over the years. False passports were one of the few assets that an operative could maintain independently without authorization from the agency. If you could afford the right forgers, if you had the right connections in the criminal underworld, you could build yourself an escape route that the agency couldn't track. Maven had built 17 escape routes over his 16 years in the field. He was about to use his second. The train pulled away from Amsterdam Centraal at 14:33, and Maven watched the city recede through the window, knowing that he would never return. He'd spent some of his best years in Amsterdam. He'd met a woman there once, before the agency had become too consuming, before his life had become too dangerous to maintain meaningful human connections. He'd walked along the Keizersgracht at sunset and thought that maybe, when the work was done, he could have something like a normal life. That was the kind of fantasy Operative maintained to stay sane, the kind of fiction that made the moral compromises bearable. But fiction was all it was. There was no normal life waiting for him. There was only the next safe house, the next false identity, the next desperate attempt to stay alive long enough to make sure that what he'd learned didn't die with him. The woman he'd known in Amsterdam had probably never understood what he really was. She'd thought he was just another businessman passing through town, someone with a vague connection to international finance, someone mysterious but ultimately harmless. She'd been wrong about the harmless part. He'd spent his time in Amsterdam conducting operations against Russian intelligence assets, against European arms dealers, against criminal networks that the agency had determined were threats to American strategic interests. The woman had been innocent collateral in a world where innocence was increasingly irrelevant. She'd probably moved on by now. She'd probably met someone normal, someone safe, someone who could offer her the kind of future that men like Maven could never provide. The paranoia started to set in as the train crossed the border into Belgium. Every passenger who boarded the train was a potential hunter. Every conductor who passed through the cabin could be agency personnel operating under deep cover. Every announcement over the public address system could be a coded message designed to activate sleeper assets. Maven had been trained to recognize patterns, to see threats in normal social interactions, to understand that in the world of intelligence, nothing was ever what it appeared to be. The training had saved his life more times than he could count. It had also made him fundamentally incapable of trust. In Brussels, he made contact with an old asset, a former Soviet intelligence officer who defected and now worked freelance, providing safe houses and resources to operatives on the run. The asset's name was Petrov, and he was one of the few people in the world who understood what Maven was going through. Petrov had been hunted by his own service. Petrov had survived by becoming a ghost, by accepting that survival meant erasing everything that made you human. "You have the documents?" Petrov asked, his Russian accent still thick, despite 30 years of living in Western Europe. "Yes," Maven replied, showing him the waterproof container. $847 million in CIA black budget allocations, enough to bring down the entire upper management of the intelligence community. Petrov examined the records with the kind of reverence that a priest might reserve for holy relics. "This is significant. This is the kind of document that changes history." He paused. "But it's also the kind of document that gets you killed. The people you're going up against, they don't follow rules anymore. The agency shared its pretense of legality years ago. They operate like a criminal enterprise now, but with government resources and governmental immunity." "I know. That's why I need to make sure this information reaches the media, not Congress, not the intelligence committees, the media. Once it's public, the agency can't make it disappear. They can make you disappear. They can make everyone you've ever known disappear. They can erase your entire existence from the records, and nobody will ever know you were real." Maven understood the truth of what Petrov was saying. The question that haunted him now was whether it mattered. If he died and the information lived, wasn't that the definition of victory? If he sacrificed his existence to bring down the machinery that had consumed his life, wasn't that at least meaningful? But meaning was a luxury for people who had the time to contemplate such things. Maven didn't have that luxury. Maven had maybe 48 hours before the agency's hunters caught up with him in Brussels. 48 hours to arrange the document transfer. 48 hours to make sure the information made it to a journalist with the credibility and the courage to publish it. 48 hours to disappear into whatever remained of his life after the agency decided he was no longer worth hunting. The first incident happened at hour 16. Maven was making his way through the Galerie Royale Saint-Hubert when he noticed the woman in the blue coat. She was following him. Not aggressively, not obviously, but she was following him with the kind of training that indicated training. Maven changed direction abruptly, moving toward a clothing store. The woman did the same. He made eye contact with her for a brief moment. She looked away first, a tactical error that suggested she was newer to this kind of work than he was. But newness didn't matter if you had the resources of the entire American intelligence apparatus backing you up. Maven purchased a new coat, changed his appearance as dramatically as he could in the changing room of a boutique, and exited through a back alley. He didn't see the woman again, but he could feel her presence, feel the network of hunters that was closing in around him. The agency's surveillance was becoming more visible now. They weren't even trying to hide. That meant they were confident. That meant they thought they had him contained. That meant they were probably right. At hour 32, Maven made contact with a journalist named Catherine Wells at the International Herald Tribune. Wells had broken stories about CIA black operations before.
Wells had the credibility, the resources, and most importantly, the courage to publish information that other journalists wouldn't touch. Maven arranged a dead drop in the Parc de Bruxelles. The bank records would be transferred to Wells at 18 that evening. After that, Maven's usefulness would be largely theoretical. He would become a liability to Wells, a connection that could be severed if the legal pressure became too intense. But the documents would live. The information would live. That was the important part. Maven spent the afternoon preparing for the inevitable. He purchased a new burn phone. He transferred what remained of his liquid assets to untraceable accounts. He wrote a letter to his sister, the only family member he had left, explaining nothing, apologizing for everything, saying goodbye without explicitly acknowledging what goodbye actually meant. The letter was addressed to a private mailbox that the agency didn't know about, routed through a former army buddy who'd agreed years ago to serve as a cutout if Maven ever needed one. If you were in Maven's position, would you have done anything differently? The dead drop was supposed to be simple. Maven would leave the documents in a trash bin near the fountain. Wells would retrieve them within 5 minutes. Maven would disappear into the city's evening crowds. Wells would take the documents to her editor. By morning, the story would be published. By afternoon, the agency's senior leadership would be arrested. By evening, Maven's sacrifice would have meant something. But nothing was ever simple in the world of intelligence. The hunters were waiting at the park. Not just Wolcott. There were at least 12 of them, positioned at strategic points around the fountain, creating a perimeter that Maven would never be able to breach. They'd anticipated the dead drop. They'd monitored Wells's movements. They'd probably intercepted his communication with her, decoded the coordinates he'd provided, and positioned themselves accordingly. Maven had maybe 90 seconds before the hunters moved in. 90 seconds to make a decision that would define what remained of his life. He could abandon the dead drop, abandon the documents, and attempt to escape the perimeter. He had contingencies for that. He could disappear into the city, move to safe house number 7, and wait for the hunters to pass. But the documents wouldn't be transferred to Wells. The story wouldn't be published. The agency would continue to function, would continue to extract their bribes, would continue to use government resources for personal enrichment, while young operatives like Maven continued to sacrifice their lives in the service of institutional corruption. Or he could complete the dead drop. He could walk into the fountain area with full knowledge that he was walking toward a bullet. He could ensure that the documents made it to Wells. He could ensure that the story was published, and he could die knowing that his death at least had meant something. Maven made his choice. He walked toward the fountain with the documents in his hand, moving slowly, deliberately, his face calm despite the terror that was screaming in every cell of his body. The hunters would see him. They would recognize him. They would move in. It would all be over in seconds. But those seconds would be enough for Wells to close the distance and retrieve the documents. Those seconds would be enough to change everything. But as Maven approached the fountain, something unexpected happened. A tourist, a young woman with a backpack and a camera, stepped directly in front of him, blocking his path. Maven tried to navigate around her. She moved with him, maintaining the block. And Maven realized with a sudden clarity that cut through the paranoia like a blade that the tourist was Wells. She'd come herself to retrieve the documents. She hadn't sent an intermediary. She'd come to make sure the exchange happened, to make sure the information reached her hands directly. He handed her the waterproof container. Their eyes met for a moment. No words were necessary. She understood exactly what this moment meant. She understood that she was receiving the documents that cost Maven 16 years of his life, that she was receiving information that would probably cost her her career, that she was receiving the weight of history that now rested on her shoulders. The hunters moved in. But Wells was already running, already moving through the crowd with the documents clutched against her body. The tourists scattered, confusion erupted. The clean extraction that the hunters had planned became a chaos of screaming civilians and overwhelmed security protocols. Maven was tackled by 3 operatives. His arms were wrenched behind his back. He felt the muzzle of a pistol pressed against his spine. But he was smiling, because the documents were safe, because Wells had them, because in approximately 12 hours the story would be published, because his 16 years of sacrifice, his 16 years of moral compromise, his 16 years of erased humanity had finally meant something. As the hunters dragged him away from the fountain, Maven caught a final glimpse of Wells disappearing into the Brussels evening. She had the documents. She had the information. She had his legacy, and in that moment, Maven understood that he'd finally won. The agency could execute him. They could erase him from the records. They could pretend he'd never existed, but they couldn't stop what was about to happen. The machinery of corruption was about to be exposed, and there was nothing they could do about it. The question that haunted him throughout his interrogation was whether the agency could convince Wells to suppress the story. The question that kept him sane was knowing that it didn't matter anymore, because the information was out there, because too many people had seen it now, because the story was going to be published no matter what happened to him. And that was enough.